Hey guys, today we are going to be talking about how I got 2024 off to a pretty decent start with reading 7 books, DNFing 2, and starting and making progress in 2 more. So looking back on January, I feel like I did pretty well. I will say mentally I didn't get January off to a great start because throughout the month I felt like just completely overwhelmed with reading all of the time. And I still feel like, or I felt like in the moment, like I should have been reading more. But looking back on it, like I did really well. So getting into the stats just to illustrate that. In January, I read a total of 7 books, which added up to 3,127 pages and broke down to an average of 101 pages per day. For the star ratings, I had 1 2-star, 3 3-stars, 2 4-stars, and 1 5-star, which breaks down to an average of 3.42 per book. For the demographics, I read 2 new adult and 5 adult books. For the formats, we had 4 standardly formatted novels. I listened to 2 audiobooks and I read 1 webcomic. For the genres, we had 4 fantasy romance, just 1 fantasy, 1 non-fiction, and 1 romance. And lastly, for the places where I sourced these books from, 6 of them came from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2024, and 1 of them was an audiobook that I listened to on Everand. So as usual, when these things happen, I will be starting off with my DNFs. If you guys haven't managed to catch it yet, I have started a new vlog project on my channel, which I'm aiming to be like my main project for 2024, called Shelve It or Scrap It. I have just posted the first episode if you want to go ahead and check that out, but it essentially involves me getting all of the books that I currently have in stacks on the floor that I shouldn't have onto my shelves by the end of the year. And my DNFs were sadly part of that project, which was unprecedented because all of the books in the stacks are ones that I'm excited to read. They're not there for any other reason than my shelves are currently at capacity. The great thing about that challenge as well is that I have no idea until I'm in it, like what I'm actually going to be reading. So truly anything can come up. And I feel like that was perfectly illustrated in the first episode. So my first DNF was Brutal Mate by Lee Savino and Tabitha Black. This one is an alien romance following a girl who is abducted by aliens on her way back from a BDSM club that she's trying to get into. She's sold at like this alien slave market and this guy buys her. It's Omegaverse, so I had my first experience with knotting in the 50 pages I read of this one. And to be honest, this was a book that I picked up for free, which is the only reason that I had it. I read Ice Planet Barbarians. This has a very similar setup and I didn't like that. And while I actually enjoyed this more than Ice Planet Barbarians, a little bit of it that I read, I just knew that it was probably going to be a 2 or a 3-star read for me, and so I couldn't be bothered. I gave it a try. I don't think I'm an Omegaverse girly and I DNF'd this one. The other one that I DNF'd I'm a little bit more sad about. This is one that I have owned for about 5 years now and I was kind of excited but very intimidated by it, which is Black Leopard Red Wolf by Marlon James. I knew going into this one that it was going to be incredibly dark and incredibly graphic. It is following a guy who is a tracker and he normally works alone, but he has been asked to help to find this boy, and everybody kind of wants this boy and he wants to get to the bottom of why, as well as actually finding the boy. Now I read 200 pages of this book and we had not even embarked on the mission to find the boy. Like we'd only just been introduced to this mission by people asking, like finally getting around to asking Tracker to kind of get involved with this. It is incredibly dark and incredibly graphic, as I knew going into it, but I don't feel like I truly anticipated the level of disgust I would feel while I was reading this, which made it just not a pleasant reading experience. And while the writing style in here is a little tricky, takes a moment to get used to, I was actually finding it to be very absorbing, but I just never wanted to pick it up and I wasn't having a good time when I was reading it because of how grim it was. It does have a ton of content warnings, so if you're thinking of going into this, then definitely look them up. One of the massive ones in here is like pedophilia and like graphic sexual assault of children and people in general, but children. Bestiality, gore, like this truly has it all. And Marlon James does it in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable intentionally because we're not supposed to be complacent when we're reading about violence. But it actually isn't that put me off this. It was actually the description and how even the description was disgusting, and the way that everything was kind of described was just unpleasant. Like the way that he would smell things to get the scent of his target and be like, oh, this smells like piss and shit. And I'm like, nothing about this is enjoyable at this point, so I did put this one down. The reviews of this on Goodreads are very mixed. It's 1 or 5 stars with absolutely no in between. So I feel like potentially I could have enjoyed this if I'd have pushed through, but I don't feel like enjoyed would have been the right word with this one. It would have been more of an appreciate, I guess, if anything, because it was just not a good time. So the first book that I actually finished was Badlands by Stacey Marie Brown. This one is book 4 in the Savage Land series, which is the series that my Patreon book club is currently going through. It is a like post-apocalyptic kind of fantasy romance following a girl who lives in a world that is divided between the humans and the Fae. This is a result of a war that happened when the veil between the worlds of the humans and the Fae fell, and the only conclusion that everyone could come to for a peaceful existence was to separate the city of Budapest, so you have Fae on one side and humans on the other. We're following our main character Brexley, who from her position of privilege as the ward of the king, the human king that is, steals drugs from trains that transport them through the different halves of the city and puts those drugs onto the black market so that the profits go to people who like actually really need the money instead of the elite. So one day when she's doing this, she is caught at the checkpoint to the Fae side of the city and thrown into this maximum security Fae prison, where she meets this guy called Warwick Farkas that she is like inexplicably drawn to. The series is very repetitive. We have explosions constantly. Like the amount of explosions in this series, I would say that 4 books in, and they're not very big books, I would say we have had at least 15 explosions. It's a lot of the same. That being said, it is generally very enjoyable. It's quite an addictive read. And this book in particular though, I felt was a little bit different. I kind of enjoyed it more because I felt like it broke away from the status quo. We had alternative solutions to problems than explosions, for one. We also had, because of like the nature of how this book starts off, we had very different dynamics between the characters, which I actually quite appreciated, because this series does deal with like sex magic almost, which is literally my least favorite thing. Like it's such a lazy way of building sexual tension, and we had a little bit of a break from that in here, as well as, like I said, those different character dynamics. And we also had an alternative ending. I feel like the endings of these books are very predictable, and this one kind of just generally went in a different direction. That being said, I don't feel like this one was as compulsively readable as the 3 books that have come before it. I did give it a 3-star overall, which is kind of just the standard for this series. I enjoy them, but I acknowledge that like they're not necessarily anything special, or they're more like head empty brain candy reads for me, if anything. So it was enjoyable, it was a good time. I enjoyed the break from the status quo, but not as addictive as the previous books in the series. I then read another romance book, which was Stolen Air by Sophie Lark, and this one has actually been on my currently reading since September. I kept dipping in and out of it and just reading odd chapters, and I just felt like I really needed to actually prioritize this one and get it finished. But this one is the 2nd book in the Brutal Birthright series, which is a series of mafia romances that focus on predominantly on the Irish and the Italian mafia of Chicago, although it does also deal, especially in this one, with the Polish and I think also the Russian mafia of the city. So this one is following the daughter of the Irish family, who is very much sheltered and protected from the family business, and she is a ballet dancer. Our love interest in here is the head of the Polish mafia, and he has a score to settle with the Italians and the Irish, and so he kidnaps their daughter, the daughter of the Irish family. It is a low-key Beauty and the Beast retelling as well. I say low-key, but it is very clear about trying to be that, with like referencing Beauty and the Beast so many times throughout here, and the main character does call the love interest the Beast quite a lot. And I gotta be honest, like I really like Sophie Lark's books, I really like Sophie Lark's writing, but I'm not really in this series for the romance, and I'm also not really in it for the plot. It's just Sophie Lark has this writing style that is just so compulsively readable that you struggle when you're in the story to put them down, and this was definitely no exception. I gave this one 3 stars because I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed some of the romantic elements in here, and I feel like they're like predictable in the way that a lot of romance is predictable, but I do feel like they are very enjoyable in the moment. And I do feel like if you are looking for a contemporary romance that you can just really easily fall into and get swept away with, Sophie Lark may be for you, because that writing style just really like grabs you and keeps you hooked the entire way through. I then read the catch-up book club book for the months of November and December, which was Red Country by Jo Abercrombie. This one is the 3rd standalone in the First Law universe, which I would low-key argue is not a standalone. I understand that they're standalones in terms of them being self-contained stories, but I feel like you are missing like 85% of the enjoyment that you can get from these books if you haven't read the previous installments, because of the context. Like, I feel like this one especially relies on context, and while you could have a good time without knowing the context, I feel like a lot of it will just go, like, you just could enjoy it so much more if you do know the context, if I'm being honest. So this one is supposed to be Joe Abercrombie's take on a Western, and I will say that while it had a lot of the like settings and the themes of a Western, it didn't feel like a Western in writing, and that is something that I very much appreciated, because I don't like Westerns, and you guys knew before I went into this I was trepidatious, I was nervous knowing that it was a Western. So we have like saloon towns, we have like a traveling caravan, we have cattle driving. I think, is there a train in here? There is mention of steam technology coming into this series in this book, so it definitely has the elements of a Western, but for me it didn't feel like it, which was great. So this one is following a young woman who is a merchant, and I think she like farms and then takes her stuff to sell, and she is with her stepfather selling all of the goods that she has, and when she comes back she finds out that her farm has been ransacked and her younger brother and sister have been taken. So herself and her stepfather are following the like trail of destruction that these bandits that have kidnapped her siblings have left in their wake to eventually get them back and bring them home. They obviously encounter a lot of problems on the way, and I would say that this book mainly focuses on the journey that they go on, both like physically and personally, as they are trying to get these kids back. Other people join them, they join other people, they stop off at places along the way. You have that mix of recurring characters and new characters that happens in Joe Abercrombie standalones, and I feel like because of who one of the characters is in this book, like context is super important, because that provided like 80% of the enjoyment for me, seeing this character once again. Now, a lot of Joe Abercrombie's books have this undertone of futility, this element of nihilism, which just really stresses me out, and that's what I'm really not loving about this series. This book once again ended on that note. However, I did enjoy getting a little bit more of different political factions in this one. Essentially, the overarching plot of the first law has these two opposite sides kind of moving chess pieces around, and we're kind of watching the nitty-gritty of the game as it's happening, like in the background, I guess. And I enjoyed seeing the other side than we are usually seeing in this one. I also really enjoyed some of the side characters and their like personal growth throughout here, whilst also getting reacquainted with some characters we're familiar with and seeing the continuation of their journey. Now, I will say that the writing style in this one was a little bit of a miss for me to start off with, because sometimes, especially with the standalones, Joe Abercrombie, with it being a standalone and it being real short, I feel like he introduces characters too quickly to the point where like I'm not really following who is who, and I don't really know like who is who is relevant, until it gets to a point where it kind of becomes clear. But that happens at a point in the book where I've already formed this sort of like level of detachment because I'm really struggling to follow it, and this one did start off like that. It is very much dependent in this one on which character you're following, with how kind of like difficult the storyline is to follow, and I did notice that in areas where certain characters weren't present, I was having a better time than like when they were. So still not as good as the First Law trilogy in my opinion, but I think this and the Heroes were much better than Best Served Cold for different reasons. And I'm excited that I know after we read the short story collection, like the next big thing that we have in this world is going to be another trilogy. So this one I believe I gave 3 stars to. My 1 5-star for the month was actually the audiobook that I listened to on Everand, and that was The Woman in Me by Britney Spears. It is Britney Spears' memoir that she released, I think was it towards the middle to the end of last year. I've been wanting to listen to this one for a while. It is narrated by Michelle Williams, who I think did a really good job with the narration of this. It's obviously just like Britney's life story, especially as she's come out of this conservatorship and is finally able to kind of tell her truth. It was very, very shocking in parts, which I feel like is part and parcel, like we all knew it was going to be. What I didn't actually know is how tumultuous her life has always been. I thought that a lot of it was like very recent developments, or recent as in like the last 10 years or so, but I thought that it was very, very gripping. It's very sad, obviously, with Britney in particular, and the way that that she was treated, but also the way that women in general are treated in the music industry, and like the level of sexism like even women that were and are as famous as Britney Spears have faced, and also the way that this was kind of allowed to happen to her was actually quite bizarre when you look into like what the nature of a conservatorship is and what it's typically used for. But definitely would recommend giving this a listen. It is available on Everand. You can also, if you have Spotify Premium, it's a pretty short one, so you can have it within your allocated hours for the month. And I don't want to say I loved it, because I think a 5-star non-fiction is very different to a 5-star fiction. It's not that I enjoyed this one that I gave it 5 stars, it's that I found it to be very, very interesting. I then read Laur Limpus Volume 4 by Rachel Smith. I wanted a little bit of a break, and also one of my main goals for the year is to catch up on series, make sure that I'm reading sequels when they come in, and so this one was kind of like an easy way to do that. Did I say Volume 4? This is Volume 5, but Laur Limpus is a fantasy romance like Hades and Persephone retelling. It is a webcomic and it is absolutely gorgeous. It is available to read free online because it is a webcomic, but I personally wait for it to be bound up into volumes and ingest it that way. And this one, as I said, it's a Hades and Persephone retelling, but it does contain all of the gods of Olympus as well. They've all been modernized. This is all set in cities, like the realms that the gods preside over are all cities. They have technology. They've been brought into the 21st century, so they're relatable, like it's funny, but this also doesn't shy away from the darker elements of Greek mythology, such as domestic abuse, sexual assault, and that kind of thing. I will say though that the relationship between Hades and Persephone in here is like super wholesome, and it is like essentially this whole series is pretty much mutual pining. Now, I did give this installment 4 stars, and that is because I thought that the first half was very strong. My enjoyment of these volumes, I've said it before, very much hinges on how present the relationship, like how much at the forefront the relationship of Hades and Persephone is in each volume. And this one, the first half, so strong. It was amazing. I loved it. The vibes were immaculate. And then the second half started a new kind of story arc that felt like it came out of nowhere because it started halfway through this volume. And I do obviously understand the nature of webcomics and the fact that like they're published differently. They're published like every 2 weeks in very small episodes. So potentially like when this story arc started as it was published as a webcomic, it wasn't as jarring, but I felt like because it started in the middle of this volume as opposed to like at the start of a volume, it felt kind of out of place, and I wasn't sure where it had come from based on where we just left off in the episode previous. So 4 stars overall. I loved the first half. Second half lost me a little bit, but I still love this series and I'm excited to continue. And then my second 4-star read of the month was my reread of House of Sky and Breath by Sarah J Maas. This one is the sequel to my favorite book of all time, which is House of Earth and Blood, and that one is an urban fantasy romance following a half-fae woman called Bryce Quinlan, who is tasked with investigating a string of murders because the arch-governor of the territory believes that she has a personal tie to the murderer or the victims that will help her to solve it where nobody else can. They previously thought that they'd caught this killer. Turns out they hadn't, and so Bryce is put on the case with the help of a fallen angel called Hunt Athalar, who is to serve as her bodyguard. So I love book 1. You all know this. I'm not going to go on about how and why I love book 1 again, especially because I just reread it in December, so you can catch all my thoughts there. This one I struggle with, and I was dreading reading it because I knew that I struggled with it the first time round, and I actually struggled with it even more the second time round. Now, I am the biggest Sarah J Maas fangirl. You all know this. If you've been watching my channel from the start, I have always been a Sarah J Maas fangirl because I think I read my first Sarah J Maas book 2 years before I even started my channel. This one is difficult in particular because with me loving House of Earth and Blood so much, I still love the characters, I still love the world, I still love the relationships in here, I love the side characters. This has my favorite cast of Sarah J Maas characters and probably my favorite setting. This book, however, I would say is arguably just not great. Like, I knew that it was going to be slow going into my reread because it was slow the first time around. I do love the side characters in here, but in this installment it feels like we're almost pointlessly following some of their arc for the purpose of them being relevant later on. So we don't really need to follow their stories in this book, but I feel like they're going to be super prominent in book 3, which I haven't read yet, just so you know. Do not even mention it in the comments. But I feel like because they're supposed to be relevant, or they're going to be relevant later down the line, we have to get to know them a little bit better in here, which, I mean, fair enough. But what I didn't expect, and what I only really realized on reread, is that this this book is just not really great. Like, there are so many conveniences, so many people just popping out of the woodwork to save people at the perfect opportune moments. Everyone's related to somebody else in a way that's just like super convenient for the storyline. And it's also very, very info dumpy in terms of like character monologues and characters just conveniently finding out a bunch of information that they need, because this tries to do so much. Like, it brings the rebellion that is part of book one more to the forefront, gets super political about it, introduces you to these whole new factions, introduces an antagonist that wasn't necessarily that much of it, once again was in the background like the rebellion was in book one, and then tries to do something super, super ambitious in terms of everything. That's all I'm going to say about that, because spoilers. And I just feel like it wasn't the best executed, and it relied on a lot of kind of like lazy storytelling elements. That being said, I am, like I said, massive trash for Sarah J Maas, so I still rated this really highly. I gave it 4 stars, but it is very unusual for me to rate Sarah J Maas anything less than 5 stars, because the characters, the world, the relationships, the found family, the actual family dynamics in here, 5 stars. The rest of this just kind of really fell off, so 4 stars in that regard. I feel like the storytelling was like 3 or 2 stars, so we're gonna just call it a 4 and leave it at that. I really hope that I enjoy book 3 a little bit more, but only time will tell. I'm not going to be getting to that until the end of February, so I would really appreciate if you just wouldn't mention it in my comments, because it's really important to me that I have my own experience with that book, so that I can bring you guys the Sarah J Maas content that you enjoy without being influenced by other people's opinions. Thank you very much for respecting my boundaries. And then the final book that I read was my 2-star rate of the month. This was a massive disappointment, guys, and I'm so upset about it, because this was one that came up in the Shelve It or Scrap It challenge, and I was so hyped for it. It was one of the books in the stacks that I was like, if these handful of books, if any of these come out, these are the best case scenario. So I 2 stars. It wasn't great, and that was the Hurricane Wars by Thea Guanzon. I swear that I had heard good things about this. I don't know whether it was just like pre-release hype, but since I was reading it and I said on Instagram like I wasn't enjoying it very much, so many people also like agreed with me that this wasn't great. So this is Reylo fanfiction, and I knew this going into it, but it is Reylo fanfiction done in a way that like literally Kylo Ren and Rey are picked up out of Star Wars and dropped into this book, which is essentially the Grishaverse. It is following a light soldier. She's fighting for the Dominion, and it's this war that's been going on for years with the Empire, which is where the male character Alaric is from, are just gaining more and more foothold. Like, the Dominion are very sorely losing, and they are on the brink of losing this war. And that's where we start out. In the first chapter, we have a very lightsabery kind of battle between these two, and it establishes the fact that these two countries are at war. So we're following this girl who is fighting for the Dominion, but she has this light power that is from a different realm that the Shadow Empire originally went to war with. So these two meet, and they obviously have these polar opposite abilities, and they immediately are enemies because they're on opposite sides of this war. But are they really? Quite early on in this book, the equilibrium shifts, and we end up taking it to this different territory where these two then have to try and build an alliance for the good of the future, like for the peace of the realm. And it turns into like an arranged marriage kind of situation, and it's obviously like an enemies to lovers romance. Now, that was a terrible synopsis from me, but I just truly cannot do any better, because I just feel like the world building was not great in this book, and I feel like the place where we started this story was also not ideal. Like, it wasn't the best introduction into this world, and I feel like the entirety of this book relies on you knowing that it's Reylo fanfiction to fill in the gaps that the author isn't. The interesting thing about this is that it is very descriptive. It is very, very descriptive, so you'd think that it would be more absorbing, would have a better atmosphere, but I felt that it was overwritten to the point where it was a lot of pretty words that were saying absolutely nothing to help me feel grounded in this series at all. I feel like the war was not the best place to establish this book. I feel like we would have been better starting this story about 40% in and establishing the war as something that had happened, like that was ongoing, that was in the very recent past, and that our characters were dealing with the after effects of it. Now, I didn't get into this because obviously like I didn't find the writing to be engaging. I didn't find it easy to kind of find myself sinking into this world, but I also really couldn't get behind the characters. And I actually really like Reylo fanfiction, as I have seen it done in published novels, like with Ali Hazelwood. I also read You Again recently, which is Raylo fan fiction and contemporary romance. And I feel like what contemporary romance authors are doing with the base of Raylo is working. I don't feel like this worked, because I'm not gonna go, if you want to hear my true feelings on Kylo Ren as a character, please go and watch the vlog that I just posted. But the reason why they're doing what they're doing is not valid, because we're also trying to have like an Alina Darklyn situation going on here. It's like I said, it's Star Wars meets the Grishaverse. And if we take the example of the Darkling has a vision, and the vision that he has is not necessarily a bad thing, but the means that he is going to achieve that vision is not good. Alaric and Kylo Ren, on the other hand, do not have the end vision that the Darkling has, and they're only really doing, especially in the case of Alaric, they're only doing what they're doing because somebody else is telling them to do it, and they essentially have no backbone. Like, they don't have a reason for doing bad things. They're doing bad things because it is the easy option at this point, and that is just not a villain that I can get behind at all. Like with Rey as well, the main character in here felt like a blank canvas that you could pretty much paint anybody over, and I did enjoy it more in the second half, because in the second half I feel like it comes into its own a little bit more and feels less like Raylo dropped into the Grishaverse. But by that point it had lost a lot of my interest, and like I said, I feel like this would have done a lot better if it had started at that middle point where it starts to get better, with the whole first half of this book just being like what establishes the world and the political climate before we go into the second half of this. A lot of this as well in that second half does hinge on the romance that I really don't care about, because I cannot get behind Alaric / Kylo Ren because of their poor motivations for their actions. So yeah, 2 stars, very disappointed. I was interested in this when like Harper Voyager were posting about it, and obviously the Fairy Loot edition is stunning, but I will not be continuing on with that series. I am just going to touch upon the 2 books that I started in the month very briefly, just so you can see what's coming up in February. I did start my arc of Red Sight by Meredith Morin. This one is released at the end of February, and I will have finished it before then. I'm currently only 66 pages into it, but I'm having a decent time with it so far. And then one that is going to take me the majority of February, I wanted to get as much done in January as possible so that when I get back from my trip in February I don't have too much to read before the live show, but that one is A Crown of Swords by Robert Jordan, which I am currently 140 pages of the way through, and it's 725, which to be honest for a Wheel of Time book ain't that bad. It isn't the most compelling Wheel of Time book so far, but I know a lot of them have had slow starts, so I'm just like bearing with it and chipping away at it for the foreseeable future. So those are all of the books that I read in January. Down in my comments, let me know how the start to your 2024 yet. How was your January reading? Do you feel like it was good? Could you have done better? Let me know all of the things. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as link to my Bookish Candle website, the Etsy for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you're ready to go when nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.